best podcast, the Heidelcast.
In the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's greatest heroes, created from the cosmic legends of the universe.
Scott McDermott, Harrison Perkins,
And
Scott Clark.
their mission to fight injustice, to right that which is wrong, and to serve all mankind.
And now, Scott Clark.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Greetings. So good.
Glad to be with you.
How is it now as we're recording? It's still January, so we record these a little bit in advance so that producer Brian can work his magic. So what's the temperature where you are?
Cold and snowy.
How much snow?
A couple of inches.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's not too bad.
Still, well, that's after it's. I think there was more previously.
All right.
So 28 degrees today.
Ooh, it's hot down there, huh?
That's
Yeah.
balmy. You could almost go out without a jacket.
It was -4 last week.
Brutal.
You need a coat for that. How is it for you, Scott? Does the weather vary differently from Bad Axe in Detroit?
So here we're 19,
Oh.
and
10 degrees different.
it feels like 19, but yesterday we were getting 50-mile-per-hour gusts.
Ooh.
So even though it was 30, it felt like 5.
Ooh.
But if you want to know what it looks like in Bad Axe right now, just look at Harrison's shirt. That's how white it is
Okay.
outside at Bad Axe. For the listener, Harrison is wearing the brightest white shirt in the history of the world.
I think that's actually the reflection off the snow out my window because it's actually not very white in person. I think I even bought this just because I liked the name. It was called Pina Colada.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it's not white. It's coconutty pineapple color.
I don't see any pineapple, only coconut. I need to wear sunglasses right now.
This is the useful part of the podcast for the listener.
Yeah, there you go. That's a very good look, Scott. Scott has his aviator style reflective sunglasses.
When you're staring in the sun, you need something to help you.
Well, you do. Actually, you need sunglasses when it's bright and snowy and sunny out there. And the sun does reflect off the snow, and it is pretty blinding. So, yeah, that's true. I feel like I've just been pulled over for speeding, and I'm about to be asked for my registration and license. I'm sorry, officer. I was going a little fast. I was on my way to a recording session with a couple of friends.
Or you're going to fly a fighter plane.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel the need.
Yeah.
The need for speed.
Yes. Yeah, Scott looks like he could have been an F-18 pilot or something.
I was too tall. I couldn't fit in the cockpit.
Really?
Yep. You have to be under like 6'5".
I think you're under 6'5", aren't you? Have you been growing in Bad Axe since I last saw you?
It's all the corn up there.
Let's move on. Growing in width.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happens in the winter.
Yeah, it's square footage for fighter pilot. It's not a height or anything. It's just square footage.
Oh my! So
We're talking about practice.
we're talking about practice, not a game, not a game, not a game. All right. Well, hey, let's get to it. I had some other things I was going to ask you about, but let's open up the coffer here, and I'm going to reach in. You boys can testify, right, that this is printed out, that I'm actually...
The paper's real. I see it. I was actually surprised when you pulled it out, and there it was, for real.
This is all real. So...
There's no CGI on the Heidelcast.
There's no CGI, no green screen here. I tell you...
Keeping it real.
This is from Jared, who says... Dr. Clark, Jared here. Hi, Jared. I recently heard someone lauding the Westminster Confession over and against the Belgic for saying that there are more pure and less pure churches as opposed to true and false churches. allowing for them to call Baptist churches less pure as opposed to false. But the person who said this, a faithful Presbyterian minister, also said that true and false in the Belgic Confession was understood to mean more pure and less pure, respectively. The point being that the Belgic is more gradient, like the Westminster, not as black and white as we think of true and false today. What are your thoughts on this? God bless. Well, this is an interesting question for a couple of reasons, I think. But I have a fairly strong opinions. I know, shocking.
Shocking.
Shocking, right? Titlecast News. Scott Clark has strong opinions. Film at 11. You guys are in Westminster Confession churches, and I am subscribed to both the Westminster Standards and the three forms, including the Belgic Confession. I'm subscribed as a professor to the Westminster Standards and then also the three forms. And then as a minister in the United Reformed Churches, I'm subscribed to the Belgic Confession. So 1561, Belgic Confession, Article 29. Why don't I read that? And then, Scott, do you have the Westminster in front of you?
I do.
Okay, well, I'll read Belgic 29, and then you read the relevant section of the Westminster, and then we'll discuss. So Belgic Confession, published in 1561 and adopted by the Dutch Reformed Churches in 1567 and repeatedly, and then finally definitively in 1619 at the Synod of Dort. Article 29 says, we believe that we ought to discern diligently and very carefully by the word of God what is the true church, for all sects, S-E-C-T-S, in the world today claim for themselves the name church. We are not speaking here of the company of hypocrites who are mixed among the good in the church and who nonetheless are not part of it, even though they are physically there, but we are speaking of distinguishing the body and fellowship of the true church from all sects that call themselves the church. The true church can be recognized if it has the following marks. The church engages in the pure preaching of the gospel. It makes use of the pure administration of the sacraments as Christ instituted them. It practices church discipline for correcting faults. In short, it governs itself according to the pure word of God, rejecting all things contrary to it and holding Jesus Christ as the only head. And it goes on from there to discuss the marks of a true Christian, which is important, but we'll let that sit for the moment. And Scott, what does the Westminster Confession say, and where does it say it?
Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 25 of the church. And we're going to read from paragraph 4. This Catholic Church hath been sometimes more, sometimes less visible, and particular churches, which are members thereof, are more or less pure, according as the doctrine of the gospel is taught and embraced, ordinances administered, and public worship performed, more or less purely in them.
All right, thank you. So how do you guys think about this? Because this comes up all the time, right? So the issue before us is what to do with the Baptists.
Yeah, I think it's a great question.
Mm-hmm. So what do we say? So just to get my view out on the table, I think historically understood, and I've worked on this some, if you look at the, there's no question in my mind that when the Belgic Confession was published, it meant to say that the Anabaptists are sects, S-E-C-T-S. Because that's the word they're always called in the early Reformation, fanatics, Schwärmerei, or sects, right? S-E-C-T-S. We might even today call them cults, right? We use that word. We use those words more or less interchangeably, sect and cult in that way. And then it becomes a little more complicated when you get to the 1630s, 1611 or so, 1609, 1611. You have the Baptist movement emerges, and then you have the emergence of the particular Baptist movement in the 1630s and crystallizing with the publication of the Confession in 1644, and then what we call the 1689 was originally published in 1677, but the 1689 and the development of the particular Baptist movement. And what people typically want to do is say, well, the Anabaptists were a sect and they were false churches. And then, but the Baptists are churches. And it is a little more complicated because we agree with the Baptists on a lot of things, on some really, really important things: doctrine of God, doctrine of salvation, doctrine of Christ, right? Those are all really important. And those were places where, at least in some of those, we disagreed with the Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists had a heretical Christology, for example. And so the Belgic Confession denounces the Anabaptists for their heretical Christology, but also denounces the Anabaptists for their view of baptism. And so implicitly, the argument is, well, in 1561, you were a false church if you denied infant baptism, but by the time you get to the Westminster Standards, they were a little more tolerant of denying infant baptism. And I've been looking into that for a while now, and I don't see the evidence for that.
Well, do you think that part of that is, maybe not more tolerant of the rejection of infant baptism, but if the issues are shifting so that the Baptists, the Baptistic Congregationalists, as the scholarly literature likes to call them now, in England at the time, were orthodox on some of these bigger categories, and this was the more limited area of disagreement by that time. I mean, is it not necessarily that they're more tolerant of that rejection, but that they recognize this is a different group of people making narrower mistakes than the Anabaptists that they don't want to recognize even as Christians or true churches?
I mean, I think that could be true, but I'm not sure that it is true. So I'm looking for positive evidence for that, and the positive evidence is pretty thin. What I see is the Reformed, including the Westminster Assembly, responding to the emerging particular Baptist movement and denouncing them as Anabaptists. They asked one of their members, whom they had just put in jail because he'd been caught corresponding with the king. He'd been set up in a sting operation.
With James Usher.
Yes, exactly.
You're sending those letters to Usher.
And so he got caught in this sort of sting operation. They suspected him of being a royalist. He's supposed to be a parliamentarian. It was a little odd that he got sent to Parliament in the first place. It sort of saved his bacon. It's a really interesting story. But at any rate, here he is in jail, and the assemblies approached him and said, we want you to write a response to the particular Baptists. And in that response, he denounced them as Anabaptists. And that is pretty consistently the response of the Reformed.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
So one of the questions is, are they answering the same question in the Belgic and in Westminster? And although I have no doubt that there's some overlap, I do wonder if Westminster has more in view, because so much of what has led to the assembly has been controversy with the Laudians over ceremony and ordinances. And paragraph 3 is about, the ministry, including ordinances that are meant for our good. And so I wonder if some of this, less visible aspect of the church and less pure aspect that can come upon the church is not just about Baptists, but also has in view the problems in their own communion with the Laudian impositions. It's not even extreme conformity. As Peter Lake has shown, Laudianism was far beyond even the most ardent conformists in terms of the ceremonial practices of the church. And so without trying to exclude, I'm not trying to leave a critique of the Baptists out of this. I am asking, I wonder if this is wider than just the Baptists, which I would imagine the Anabaptists are in the crosshairs, particularly in the Belgic.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. So I can prove that easily. So here's what I think. The people are reinterpreting the Westminster Confession, and then this fellow is taking that reinterpretation of 25.4, Westminster 25.4, and reading it back into the Belgic, and I don't think that's tenable at all. And it's easy to prove because, and this minister probably doesn't know this, but the author of the Belgic Confession, Guy de Brès, wrote 2 treatises before he wrote the Belgic. He wrote one against the Roman Catholic Church, arguing for the Catholicity of the Reformation over against what he argued was a sectarian practice or sectarian practices and theologies that had developed in the Western Church, culminating in the Roman Catholic Church. And he wrote another treatise against the Anabaptists. So there's no question, historically understood, that that Article 29 has in view 2 groups. The Roman Communion, which claimed to be the only true church in the world, and the Anabaptists. So the ambiguity here, and I think Harrison has already helped us here, is what is the Assembly, the Westminster Assembly, doing, right? Sitting in London in the 1640s in the midst of an English Civil War, right? What are they addressing? And I think, and you tell me what you think about this, and Harrison and Scott, you can chime in. You've worked on this period as well. You guys probably know more about this than I do, but I think they're answering the question implicitly: where was the church, the Reformation Church, before the Reformation, right? Which is a question that Roman apologists were consistently asking of the Protestants. And the way the question was formed was, where was your church before Luther and Zwingli? Turretin, if you look in his Institutes, has a whole series of basically questions and answers, answering that very question, and he deals with that at great length. So that was a question that came up, I think, from Bellarmine and other Roman Catholic apologists. And it seems to me by the time you get to 4, it's saying, look, the universal church, which is what Catholic means here, lowercase c, the ecumenical church, has sometimes been more, sometimes less visible. This is the rhetoric you see all throughout the 16th century on this question, that the church has always been there, it just hasn't always been more visible. This is the 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal argument, right? Sometimes the church has been very small and almost invisible. And then it says, and particular churches, which are members thereof, are more or less pure. So we don't have an over-realized eschatology implicitly. And the way you discern whether a church is a church is whether the doctrine of the gospel is taught and embraced. Ordinances administered. And of course, we know what the Westminster divines thought about the ordinances, the sacraments, because they're very explicit about that. And implicitly, I think, arguably, it's not definitive, but arguably critical of the Baptists on denying baptism to infants, and public worship performed more or less purely. So that's how I understand 25.4. So I don't think 25.4 is really thinking about or speaking to the Baptists at all, really. I think it's answering a different question. And I think that we're stretching 25.4 to answer a question they're not actually answering. And I think implicitly to let ourselves off the hook a little bit, because it's complicated to say, as I say, that Baptist churches are at best irregular. Right? I don't say they're necessarily false churches. I recognize the particular Baptists as irregular congregations. There's real truth there, but there's also serious error. Let us not forget that the Baptists typically, confessionally, don't recognize our baptism. So it's not we who are being divisive, right? We didn't unbaptize the whole church. The Baptists and the Anabaptists unbaptized the whole church.
It's interesting that James Ussher, during this time in the 1640s, in his lectures, was actually tackling that question, the where was your church before Luther? And he kind of goes to something that it's like, sometimes you could see it more than others.
Yeah.
And that's what Westminster 25.4 does. And I think the more or less visible is about, even within the institutional church, well, sometimes the truth of that church was more visible in its auspices than others. And that's where he seemed to go. I think our mutual friend amongst all of us, Jonathan Cruz, my good friend, reminded me not long ago about a phrase that I found useful, improperly ordered.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not ready to say that Baptist churches as we know them are, especially our confessional friends and those who hold to Orthodox doctrines and especially the doctrines of grace. I'm not ready to say that they're false churches.
No.
But that phrase, improperly ordered church, I have found helpful to express my outlook on it. There's something not rightly in order about the way they have administered the sacraments, even though they are, I think they fit within Charles Hodge's argument about what makes a baptism valid. And, there's three elements administered with water in the name of the triune God and to seal the benefits of salvation. And for that reason, we can accept their baptism, even if they don't accept ours, which seems to suggest it's not an entirely false church, just improperly ordered.
Well, we accept Roman Catholic baptism, right, on that same ground. So we're relatively tolerant on that, I think. Scott, how do you handle this pastorally? For example, someone says, I have to move and I'm not sure where to go to church, or I'm on vacation and I'm not sure where to go to church. How do you think about that?
Okay, taking a step back.
Okay.
I think I have more questions for this than I do answers.
That's good.
When it comes to true, false, is that synonymous with more pure, less pure? Is that synonymous with regular, irregular? Properly ordered, improperly ordered?
I don't think so.
Okay, so they're not different ways of saying the same thing.
I don't think so. True and false is one thing, and more or less pure, irregular, regular, irregular, proper, improper. I think those are two different sets of categories. So when I say regular, irregular, I always try to say, I'm just making that up. Right? That's not anything that, as far as I can tell, we confess, because we've never confessionally addressed this issue of what to do with the Baptists. And that's partly why it's so messy. And it's also difficult because here in the United States, there are tens of millions of Baptists, who knows how many, probably something like 60 million Baptistic evangelical Christians and something like 600,000 of us. And so we're sort of, and depending on where you are, if you're in the South, you're in a sea of Baptists, and the non-Baptistic churches more or less don't exist. They exist. They're just not very visible. They're statistically much, much more marginal. And so that makes it awkward for us to say, by the way, you guys are all false churches, which I don't exactly think is quite accurate. And just so everybody knows, when I go back home, one of the places I regularly worship is in a Baptist congregation. And every time I'm there, it's at least in the winter, they baptize people. And my good friend Pat Abendroth says, who's the minister there at Omaha Bible Church, he says, we need to get you up front here so you could be in the splash zone. So I don't want people to think, oh, Clark hates Baptists, because I see that online all the time. And I don't.
Another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the Belgic, how can we know if it's a true or false church? Based on the marks, yes?
That's right. Pure preaching of the gospel, pure administration of the sacraments, and the use of church discipline.
How can we know if it's a more pure or less pure church, according to the Westminster Confession?
Well, doesn't it say in 25:4?
It's the same. It's the marks of the church.
I think so.
Those are two different angles on the same, the same issues may be on the table, but, if it's, are they there or not? And then you say, well, no, okay, that's a false church. If you say yes, and then you say yes, but maybe not exactly the way that it ought to be. Mm-hmm. You've got more and less pure.
Okay.
When you say, yes, the marks of the church are there, and so that seems to be a real church, but those marks are there in ways that I kind of wish they were better.
Right.
Well, then you've got more and less pure.
Yeah, and that's what Van Dixhoorn says. Particular churches which are members of the universal church, so true, are more or less pure depending on the relative purity of the gospel taught and embraced in those churches, the way in which they dispense the sacraments, and the manner and conduct of their public worship. So I think to the question of Jared, he's saying it's better to use the term pure versus less pure as compared to true and false in the Belgic. So are they talking past each other? I'm just trying to actually nail down the question so that I can really understand what it is that he's getting at.
Well, so the question that I think Jared is asking here is coming out of what he's hearing from this pastor, who is, I think, looking at the Westminster and equating it to the Belgic, and then saying that both of them allow for Baptist churches. And I'm arguing, no, that's I don't believe that's true. Obviously, it's not true in the case of the Belgic, because the Belgic was responding to the Anabaptists, and it explicitly denounces churches for denying infant baptism. We detest the error. So that's very strong language. And the Baptists make the same error. So you can't say, well, we detest it when the Anabaptists do it, but we don't detest it when our Baptist friends do it. That's incoherent. That makes no sense. And it's just not historically true. I've addressed that in print. If you look at the way the Dutch churches talked about the Baptists, they didn't invent even a new word. They used the same word for the Baptists that they used for the Anabaptists. So there just isn't any evidence for that relative to the Belgic. So then the question falls to the Westminster. Is it the case that the Westminster was intending to make room for this emerging particular Baptist movement, or are they using more or less the same categories as the Belgic? And so that's one question. And then the second one is, what is the intent of 25.4, Westminster 25.4? And are they even addressing this question of what to do with the Baptists? And that's a little more difficult.
On the first one, is it this or that? Well, because of the answer to the second question, were they even trying to address this? I don't think it was their primary thing, which makes me think, I don't think it's the same pronouncement as Belgic, and I also don't think it was the attempt to make room for the Baptists.
I think that's right, because I think by intent they're addressing a different question. And I think that is, where was the church? Where was your church before the Reformation? Because we can show this, in the Roman argument is we can show this continuous presence of the church, from, they would say, the 2nd century to today. And where were you people? And so implicitly, this is answering that. Well, we've always been here, but sometimes more visible, sometimes less visible. Which is the answer that the Reformed tended to give to that question. And you can see that, as I say, in Turretin's response to that question. But I think Scott makes a point when he says that if you look at the language, the categories invoked in 25.4, right? What are the things you're looking for to find a more pure church? The doctrine of the gospel is taught. And of course, we agree with our confessional our particular Baptist friends on the gospel. We say the same thing about the gospel, amen. And so we have real fellowship there. The public worship performed more or less purely. I don't know that we have any grave issues with them there. So the issue comes with using the language of the Westminster, ordinances administered. And certainly they are administered, but and it's interesting, there's no qualitative language there in that phrase or that clause, ordinances administered. But those are roughly the same categories used by the Belgic, even though they're not necessarily addressing the same question. So we can use those categories, I think, to help us sort this out. And as I say, we can look at the external history of how members of the assembly and how the assembly itself responded to the emerging particular Baptist movement.
So in other words, we can use the answers to the questions they were answering to help give us a framework to answer questions we have, but it would not be right and most helpful to demand that they were answering the exact questions we have.
That's exactly right. Very well said. Dr. Harrison Perkins. That's very well said.
I'm part of the house band now.
You are, exactly. Scott, does that help you?
Well said. This is why you are a doctor and not a nurse.
Not the kind of doctor who can help people, though.
It's not Nurse Perkins, it's Dr. Perkins. So where would you send your congregation if they're on vacation? Would you have them go through that list?
Yeah, I think that'd be great if our people would use these 3 marks of the church as a rubric by which to decide where to go to church. And so without
Just stay out of the splash zone.
yeah, without binding their conscience. I when we're back home, at least once when we're back, and we try to go back twice a year, I go hear Pat because I know that he is going to preach the gospel joyfully, warmly, biblically, and I'm happy to be with them. And
which version of the ESV does he use, though? 2016 or 2001?
Yeah, to go back to last week, yeah. I don't know. Actually, I have no idea what translation he uses. That's an interesting question. I'll have to ask him one time what translation he uses. I think he uses the ESV.
Get back to us.
Yeah. All right, boys, this has been great. I appreciate this very much. And listener, I hope you've found this edifying too.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast